Today's debate is about one very simple but profoundly important goal, Mr. Speaker, and that is restoring our vibrant economy by reducing the crippling weight of the growing debt caused by our federal government. In the coming months, we face a string of deadlines that will force Congress and the administration to address the fundamental challenge of our trillion-dollar deficit and its mounting effect on our economy and jobs in America. We've already exceeded the $16 trillion in debt, and Republicans find this debt level absolutely unacceptable, and that is why we are here today. By contrast, President Obama seems to be perfectly comfortable with the idea of reaching $23 trillion, which is where we'll be at the end of his second term if we continue his policies in that direction. While $16 trillion in debt is stifling our economy, $23 trillion would crush it. It would crush the dreams and hopes and aspirations of our great nation and the people who will certainly follow us, our children and our grandchildren. That's why today we are considering this rule and the underlying bill in order to reverse this course. Our great Speaker, John Boehner, and our Majority Leader, Eric Cantor, are pleased that this bill is on the floor today to discuss not just this important activity with our members of Congress, but to let the American people know we are serious about what needs to be done to save this country from this crippling debt. We will use the upcoming weeks and the looming deadlines before us as a means to enacting a more meaningful and lasting reform so that we can begin to grapple with this skyrocketing debt. At the same time, today's rule and the underlying bill will allow us to turn up pressure on the Senate to join the House in offering real solutions. Together, these actions will help to reignite our engines of growth, to grow our economy and to restore discipline and accountability to our federal budget. The first of the looming deadlines we face is the debt ceiling limit. The underlying bill would temporarily suspend this limit so that we have the opportunity to craft comprehensive reforms without risking debt and default on this debt that our nation has incurred. Risking default would be counterproductive to our Republican agenda of restoring economic growth, getting our fiscal house in order, and ensuring that we do not burden future generations with intolerable debt. We will not risk the full faith and credit of the United States, but neither will we compromise a long-term extension of this debt ceiling without slashing wasteful federal spending, enacting meaningful entitlement reform, and ending the era of trillion-dollar deficits. By taking this temporary action, we are keeping the focus where it is needed and where it's intended and help resolving the coming debates on sequestration, the expiring continuing resolution, and the FY14 budget through fiscal discipline and entitlement reform. Suspending the debt ceiling until May the 19th provides the House and the Senate with much-needed time to pass their budgets and then consider how best to deal with the sequester. The underlying bill also takes action to ensure that the Senate becomes an active partner, which we want and need, and the American people, I think, expect, in order for our efforts to reform federal spending. For nearly 4 years, the Senate has failed to meet its most basic obligation, passing a budget. During this time, the Senate has collected its own paychecks despite being derelict in its most important duty. In the private sector, there are consequences for failing to do one's job. This resolution will impose the same accountability on members of Congress that the private sector workers face. Oh, yes, and we're putting that same obligation on the House as we would want them to accept in the Senate. That is, if you don't get your work done, you don't get paid. The power of the purse is the most fundamental duty the Constitution places upon Congress. Far too long, this power has not been wielded with the discipline and accountability necessary to do responsibly and sustaining the efforts of our country properly. There are a host of challenges that must be addressed, but the entire process begins with a joint budget resolution. As long as the Senate is unwilling or unable to do its job, our efforts in the House to deliver real solutions to the American people will continue to be impeded. Some have questions whether the action we are taking is constitutional. The 27th Amendment of the Constitution prohibits legislation that varies the salary of members of current Congress. This provision was intended to prevent members of the House and the Senate from giving themselves a pay raise without first standing before the voters. This bill upholds both the letter and the spirit of the 27th Amendment. It would not change a member's rate of compensation in any way. They just don't get to collect it until they do their jobs. And until they get their work done, we simply cannot adopt a permanent extension to that debt ceiling. This body will work to ensure that the Senate performs the most basic task to pass a budget, and will do our job also. We will continue to work for meaningful entitlement and spending reforms to take us beyond our current cycle of crisis and deadlines in favor of long-term solutions. And as we do all this in order to invigorate our economy and to put our nation back to prosperity for ourselves and for future generations, I urge my colleagues to support this rule and to the underlying legislation. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time is reserved.